I want you to show the New York Times piece on the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. Okay, so I cannot read
Can
that.
you show it on the other screen? There we go. Thanks.
Yeah. So in any case, what we've got here is a situation with the vaccines that is far more interesting and in which there is far more for us to discuss than I believe we realize. So we have two first past the post vaccines of this very new type, this mRNA vaccine platform, which is untested in humans, which has only been around tested in humans for the last 9 or so months. And then we have a third vaccine.
So those are the makers of those, with which are the names with which people will be familiar, are Pfizer and Moderna, right?
Right.
Okay, so the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are separately created mRNA vaccines, which is a new vaccine technology, which the advantage of which is they can actually be developed in like a weekend, apparently, whereas traditional vaccines tend to take a lot longer. But you can't, okay, now I'll stop there.
We have no safety record of their long-term implications. We have no concept of how they interface. They're extremely expensive to deploy because of the need for extreme refrigeration, etc. So anyway, I feel like we shouldn't have to say this every time, but because we're going to get clipped again and again being called anti-vaxxers and all of this garbage, let us hope that these mRNA vaccines are what they promise to be. This is an entirely new mechanism for delivering vaccines. And it is quite possible that these will be lower side effect, better, and because they're rapidly deployable, this may be the answer to some of humanity's greatest new problems, which involve emerging new viruses, either through bioterrorism or who knows what else.
COVID-19 won't be the last. If mRNA vaccines are effective and safe, that could be the way that we survive the emerging viruses and even perhaps viral bioweapons that could be emerging.
Right. So you and I are rooting for these vaccines to be an awesome addition to our antivirus quiver.
Really hope so.
Right. On the other hand, frightening that we are going to deploy these at such large scale with some of the most important people in society in the midst of a pandemic without properly investigating or properly considering what it means to deploy something on which we have no long-term data on the safety. We don't know if these cause something, months or years, years down the road.
So actually, let me say that if these mRNA vaccines 5 years down the road do prove to have been safe-ish, relatively safe, there will always be some problems, right? If they do,
relatively harmless.
Okay, relatively harmless. And a new virus emerges, and a mRNA vaccine is produced very quickly to deal with that virus. We would not sound the same way about that mRNA vaccine as we do about this one. Now, there are still concerns with any brand new vaccine that doesn't have a long period of safety testing. But just as I believe where you're going to go here with regard to the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine is that is a traditional vaccine. Is that right?
Yes.
And without knowing anything more than that about it, I prefer that one simply because the traditional way that we have been developing vaccines has problems, for sure. But we have decades, we have many, many decades of safety testing and efficacy testing and all of this on this route by which to end up with vaccines. You and I are more vaccinated than just about anyone else we know because of the time we've spent in the tropics, all of this. And that, yes, at the moment, because we don't have the history on mRNA vaccines, we are concerned about what we don't know. But if it is a class of vaccines that has 5 or 10 years behind it, at that point, every new vaccine that is trotted out in that with that technology will cause less concern. It should cause less concern.
It should cause less concern.
Yeah.
And so there's a question. We now have a third vaccine emerging slightly later. It has what should be several things about it that should cause us to strongly prefer it. One is it's a normal vaccine that doesn't require extreme refrigeration, so it's easily deployed. It's comparatively cheap, and AstraZeneca, who has teamed up with Oxford to generate this thing, has agreed to have it be profitless for, I don't know what the period is, but for an extended period of time. So they've offered it into the public space. I think it's $3 a dose or something like that. It's very inexpensive. We have the increased.
Oh yeah, it's like $2.50 a dose if deployed by the government, $10 a dose if privately acquired, something like that.
Right. Now, very interesting fact about it. So you will hear reported everywhere that it's much less effective at preventing COVID. Now, this makes an error in two ways. One, we don't really know what the mRNA vaccines are doing. In fact, there is caution in some circles about the fact that it may be that people who have been vaccinated with these mRNA vaccines are still perfectly capable of transmitting COVID to other people. Now,
they just don't show symptoms is the idea, or they never show up as having tested positive somehow?
Somehow. So
how would that work?
I don't expect it will. I expect we will find that it does prevent the disease and that people don't therefore transmit it.
But we don't have
the data. It's all too new. But in this case, you will see, well, okay, those mRNA vaccines are 90 or more % effective. AstraZeneca's, unfortunately, is only 60-some % effective. But get this.
Well, but actually the second sentence here says a clinical trial revealed the vaccine was up to 90% effective.
You know why?
Why?
They made an error in the testing.
Who did?
Those who were doing the testing.
Okay.
And this, welcome to complex systems, folks. They made an error in which they accidentally halved the dose, right? So they ran an experiment they didn't mean to run, and they now have data comparing what they thought was the full dose, which has something like 60% effectiveness, and half the dose, which has 90% effectiveness, very much like these mRNA vaccines, right? So, okay. Why does that happen?
An inadvertent experiment that also runs exactly counter to what you would expect and makes you wonder, how is it that the people who developed the vaccine decide on the dosage in the first place?
Well, right. And doesn't it just say that what we ought to be doing, one of the things we ought to be doing is figuring out, whatever the mechanism is that we figure out what a dose is and whether or not you need two of them, we need to vary a lot of stuff in order to figure out, did we miss it because we, were 10 times over the magic number, right? And in lots of cases we've seen stuff like that. So anyway, the point is, okay, so it turns out that the most effective dose is probably half what we thought, or maybe it gets even better if you cut it below that. Who knows? Right? Wouldn't that be good news? Right. So why does it happen? We don't know. I sort of have a guess, which is, if you think back
is this also a 2-dose vaccine like the mRNA vaccines?
Yes.
So it's a half. So the idea is it was
I believe
up to 90% effective when it was a half dose to start and then a full dose for the second one, if memory serves.
Yeah, I think that's right. But so anyway, I was going to take a guess, and I was going to say one of the things that you and I puzzled over at length on early live streams was the fact that the thing that you see in the textbook about how a virus gets you doesn't predict the fact that there's like a threshold dose, that briefly passing through a room in which some very COVID sick person has been exhaling probably doesn't get you sick, but if you spend a few minutes there, it probably will. So there's something that fills up. There's some non-specific immunity that gets overwhelmed. And at the point that it gets overwhelmed, a virus does what's in the textbook. It invades your cell and starts replicating, right? But until then, the non-specific stuff is probably good enough at clearing the garbage without recognizing it.
So your prediction here is that at the higher dose, it's actually making people sick.
Right. That it's basically, so what this vaccine does, and you can
that's totally consistent with other vaccines. It's you need to trigger your immune system to recognize and develop the right response without triggering it so much that you get full-blown whatever it is the disease is you're vaccinating against.
You won't get full-blown, you won't get the disease from the vaccine no matter what. But the test was, if you get the vaccine, are you vulnerable if you encounter somebody with COVID? Yep. So scroll up if you can, Zach.
Sorry, I did not mean to imply
No, that's okay. Yeah. Keep going. Keep going. All right. So here you've got this adenovirus vaccine. This is the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. It enters the cell, and it does a much more standard thing than the mRNA vaccines. The mRNA vaccines bypass the nucleus, and what they do is they dump mRNA into the system, which ribosomes then transcribe into proteins that then get displayed to the immune system. In this case, you have this virus, this harmless virus, introduce DNA with the proper information in it into the nucleus in a standard way. The nucleus then transcribes it into mRNA, which then does effectively the same thing from there that the mRNA vaccines do. So keep scrolling up.
So let me just say that the only reason that this feels less science fiction-y than the mRNA vaccines is because we've been doing this for decades already. It is inherently moved from the realm of science fiction to science fact decades ago, and the mRNA vaccines moved from science fiction to science fact in 2020, and therefore we don't know what all is downstream of that move.
Zach. Yep. So anyway, the hypothesis that we are playing with here, which again, this is not our area of expertise, but just based on everything that we've talked about with respect to threshold doses and the like, the possibility of the reason that a higher dose gave lower effectiveness is that there's some fraction of the immune system that is capable of recognizing particles that look something like the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. And if you gum them up with these viral particles, with these vaccine particles, these vaccine-generated particles, that it may paradoxically open up the chance that a COVID particle that you encounter in the wild can get by because they're all gummed up.
Oh.
So anyway, I don't know if
that's a different mechanism.
It's a hypothesis. Okay. So anyway, it's a testable hypothesis, which is what we like. So that predicts things about the curve that you would see for various dosages, right? That effectively higher would give you lower effectiveness to some point because it would effectively gum up all the works. But okay, so back to the point here. We got 3 vaccines. 2 of them are in a totally novel platform and therefore carry what you and I have described as high risk, which does not mean high harm. It means we don't know what happens long term when you've had this, and things on the list probably include things like autoimmune disorders. Will it give you an autoimmune disorder? No idea. Hopefully not.
High risk because high uncertainty.
Because high uncertainty, exactly. And we have seen a bunch of stuff in the article that we covered a couple of live streams ago about the very poor reporting on the side effects of the mRNA vaccines ought to loom large here too. People are getting very serious reactions sometimes to these things. But anyway, in a universe where you've got 3 vaccines, 2 of which are of this very extraordinary new type that come with high risk because high uncertainty, one of which is on a familiar platform. It's still new, but we know a lot about it because a lot of it isn't new, right? The basic virus that delivers the thing isn't new. And so
this is the one I want.
Right. And it is being portrayed as much less effective. Even if it was 60% effective, I think I still prefer this one.
And why is that? Is AstraZeneca not an American company? Like what?
It's British. Well, actually, I don't want to say it's British. I think it is, but Oxford certainly is a British institution.
Yeah, and we put we put so much of our funding to vaccine development and not to treatment, not to these other drugs. And also, it won't be, if we're right that AstraZeneca, having signed up with Oxford, indicates that it's not an American company, much of those, the return on investment would be far lower for the in American house developed vaccines if people start preferring the traditionally developed vaccine that came from outside of the country.
At the very least, we ought to be discussing, the cost of a dose is very different. The architecture you need to deliver the dose is very different.
Rural areas
already exists here. We ought to be discussing, okay, we're going to give it to all of the medical personnel, right? Makes sense to protect medical personnel. Can we give a quarter of them or half of them this other one in case there's something we don't know?
Yeah.
I mean, that obviously makes sense, right? So the point is, you've got this...
any demographic population, any demographically described population should get a mixture if we are going to continue to learn, not any combination, but some people in that demographic should get one of these types of vaccines and some should get the other, and then those results should be tracked.
So the disturbing conclusion, I think, from the last little thing where we talked about the comparison between two drugs where the world seems to have concluded the opposite of what would make sense.
Yeah.
The comparison here between these vaccine technologies, the nonsensical discussion early on about face masks, the nonsensical discussion we are now having about face masks, where outdoors people are still looking at each other as morally deficient for not wearing them.
Oh, I got into a thing on that this week. Well, I won't go there now.
The discussion that we are having about lockdown and the inability seemingly of anybody in charge of policy to juggle the various costs of lockdown versus not lockdown. All of these discussions are, as far as I can tell, complete garbage.
Mm-hmm.
One afternoon with 5 smart people and decent information would cause a radically different policy decision than we are being fed. So what we've got is just some narrative generated some way. Now, either it's generated through incompetence or it is corrupt, which I think is more likely, where at every little stage of the process.
Well, I think we're lucky enough to have both.
Yeah, well, undoubtedly, the incompetence is a feature, not a bug, from the point of view of the corruptors.
Yeah.
But it is amazing, I think, how far we are likely underperforming by virtue of the fact that that what drug you're going to take and when you're going to take it has apparently been politicized.
Right.
Can you think of something that could possibly be a less political question? Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So I don't know what we're going to do about this, but the whole narrative surrounding COVID, which should unite us, we should have our very best people coming up with the very highest quality insights. They would no doubt make mistakes.
And there should be pushback against them, and no amount of pushback should be read as a political maneuver.
Right.
That their work shouldn't be political or politicized, and the criticisms and the trying to figure out if they're actually saying what they think they're saying and all of that shouldn't be read as political either.
Right.
This is what science is supposed to do.
And we should be discussing this on Twitter and YouTube and every other place without fear of being thrown off the platform for having violated these sacred conclusions.
Or being placed into your tribal affiliation on the basis of whether or not you are wearing a mask when you're outside, or are questioning whether or not to take the new vaccine, or are 100% going to take it no matter what, and you're willing to call people dummies if they don't.
Yeah.
None of this is smart. Any of those responses is, at best dim, and at worst, as you said, corrupt and corrupting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So just think about how different the prescription looks if you just sort of look at these analyses. These analyses could be wrong. Maybe we've seen the wrong stuff and there's more compelling stuff elsewhere. But if this stuff is right, then the answer is don't close your state parks and other stuff. Encourage people to spend as much time outdoors as possible because, among other things, vitamin D, and they won't lose their minds. Okay?
Right.
Okay. So that's good. Vitamin D, won't lose your mind. Those are 2 protective things. If you get sick with COVID, you probably want ivermectin, and you want it right away rather than waiting to see if you get super sick. And from the point of view of vaccinating people, we've got some new technologies which are promising. We've got a tried and true one, which is also rapidly developed, incredibly impressive there.
Oh, man. Yeah.
And may be equally as effective, much cheaper, right? So at least some of us ought to be getting easier to deploy. Some of us ought to be getting that one instead. And maybe the fact is we should be trying to get that to as many people as possible because it's a better bet, right? So that's that's like not radical, except in an environment where we are told that that's all heresy.
Right, because if you take that approach, you can't get looked at and immediately be put in a box and be labeled and be dismissed or embraced on the basis of what it is that you concluded. It is actually responsive to what the research says. And you and I have talked extensively on here in the past about why we don't like to say, what the data say, right? Like it's not about data driven. It's about having a model of the universe and testing that model over and over and over and over again. And whichever parts of that model keep on persisting, keep on not being falsified as you test your assumptions and your ideas and your predictions over and over and over again, the longer they persist, the greater the chance is that what you've got there is a bit of the truth, a bit of reality that is actually reflective of this objective universe that we live in, regardless of what anyone else says about it.
Yeah. Yes. Let's put it this way. The level of our failure does not appear to be closely connected to the difficulty of the problem. It's a difficult problem, but it's amazing what people have put together, and then somehow we are going to ignore or demonize or whatever out of existence at who knows what cost.